A homeless boy with nothing but his instincts, a millionaire trapped on a burning yacht. When their paths cross in the dead of night, one daring act of bravery changes both their lives forever. But what seems like a simple rescue soon unravels into a dangerous mystery, one that will leave you speechless. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. This is another powerful story from Golden Stories, where you truly feel the emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. Kai's eyes locked onto the inferno in the distance, the flames licking hungrily at the sky as the massive yacht was consumed. The glow illuminated the water, reflecting like molten gold over the dark waves. He had seen strange things at the docks before: smugglers, bodies washing up after storms, drunken fights that ended in gunfire, but nothing like this. There were no sirens, no Coast Guard, no desperate mayday calls echoing through the radio frequencies. A yacht this extravagant belonged to someone important, someone powerful, yet it was burning alone in the dead of night, abandoned to the sea. Something about it sent an itch crawling under his skin. It wasn't just an accident. Then, amidst the chaos, he spotted it, a figure barely visible through the thick smoke, moving sluggishly on the deck. Whoever they were, they wouldn't last long. Without another thought, Kai sprang into action. The fishing boats moored at the dock were mostly old and rusted, but he knew which ones had working motors and which were left to rot. He picked one at random, untying the ropes with swift, practiced fingers. His hands were calloused from years of working odd jobs around the port. Lifting crates, scrubbing decks, doing whatever it took to survive. He wasn't a hero. Hell, most days he could barely afford to eat. But something in his gut told him to go. He wasn't even sure why. Maybe it was the way the fire twisted, roaring hungrily, as if eager to consume whoever was trapped inside. Maybe it was the simple fact that he knew what it felt like to be left behind, to have no one come for you. Whatever the reason, he shoved off from the dock and started rowing. The small wooden boat creaked under his weight as he dug the oars into the water, moving as fast as he could. The closer he got, the hotter the air became, thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning fuel. As he approached the yacht, the flames intensified, crawling up the sleek metal body like living creatures. The heat radiated outward, making his skin prickle, but he pushed forward. The figure he had seen earlier had disappeared. His heartbeat thundered in his chest as he scanned the deck, searching for any sign of life. Then a sudden, violent tremor rocked the boat, nearly knocking him into the water. A muffled explosion somewhere deep inside the vessel sent a plume of fire shooting into the night sky. Kai cursed under his breath, realizing he didn't have much time. With a deep breath, he secured the boat to the side of the yacht and pulled himself up, his fingers gripping the metal rail. It was burning hot to the touch, but he ignored the sting, hauling himself over the edge and landing hard on the deck. Smoke stung his eyes, making it difficult to see. His lungs burned as he coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. The luxury that once defined the yacht was now reduced to charred debris and shattered glass. Then he saw him, a man lying near the entrance of the main cabin, barely conscious. His expensive suit was torn, covered in soot, his face streaked with sweat and ash. Kai rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside him. "Hey, can you hear me?" he shouted, shaking the man's shoulder. The man's eyelids fluttered weakly, his lips parting as he mumbled something incoherent. Kai leaned in closer, trying to catch his words. "I shouldn't be here," the man rasped. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the fear in it was unmistakable. Kai frowned, his instincts screaming that this wasn't just a case of someone getting caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Before he could ask anything else, another explosion rocked the yacht. The floor beneath them trembled violently, sending sparks flying from broken wires. The fire was spreading fast. They had to get out, now. Gritting his teeth, Kai hooked his arms under the man's shoulders and heaved him up. The guy was heavier than he looked, dead weight against Kai's own lean frame. "Come on, man, work with me here," Kai muttered, dragging him toward the railing. The heat was unbearable now, sweat dripping down his back as the fire crackled around them. The exit was just a few feet away when another shudder ran through the yacht, followed by the deep groan of metal under immense pressure. Kai's eyes darted to the side. The flames had reached the fuel reserves. If they didn't jump now, they wouldn't get another chance. With one last surge of effort, he hauled the man over the railing and into the water below, following a second later. The impact was like hitting concrete. Cold salt water slammed against his body, stealing his breath for a moment before he forced himself to resurface. The man bobbed beside him, dazed but alive. Kai grabbed onto him, keeping his head above water as he kicked toward his boat. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, exhaustion threatening to drag him down, but he refused to stop. Behind them, the yacht gave one final violent tremor before a massive explosion ripped through it. The force of it sent waves crashing outward, pushing them away as flaming debris rained down around them. Kai tightened his grip on the man, his arms shaking from the effort. With a final desperate push, he reached the side of the fishing boat, hauling the unconscious man over the edge before pulling himself up after. For a long moment, he just sat there, chest heaving, staring at the burning wreckage floating in the distance. His heart was pounding, his mind reeling. This was no accident. Someone had wanted that yacht to go down. Someone had wanted this man dead. And now, whether he liked it or not, Kai had just put himself right in the middle of it. Kai moved swiftly across the burning deck, stepping over charred debris and shattered glass as he searched for the man he had seen earlier. The fire had spread rapidly, consuming everything in its path. A section of the railing was already half melted, twisted from the heat. His eyes scanned the wreckage until they landed on a figure lying motionless near the entrance to the main cabin. The man's suit was torn, streaked with soot and blood, his face barely recognizable under a layer of ash. He wasn't just unconscious, he looked like he had been through hell. Kai knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. There was a pulse, weak but present. His breathing was shallow. Whoever he wasn't dead yet. Kai grabbed the man by the arms and pulled, trying to lift him, but the weight was dead and heavy. The yacht trembled beneath them, a deep groan of metal twisting under. Stress. A violent tremor shook the deck, throwing Kai off balance. An explosion erupted from below, sending a fiery shockwave through the air. The force nearly knocked him back, but he dug his heels in, holding onto the unconscious man. This wasn't just an accident. This yacht was meant to go down. Someone had made sure of it. He had no time to question who or why. If they stayed any longer, they'd be nothing more than ashes on the waves. Kai hoisted the man onto his back, wrapping the man's arm over his shoulder as he staggered toward the edge of the yacht. The air was thick with smoke, burning his throat with each breath. The closer he got to the railing, the more unstable the deck became. Wood cracked beneath his feet, fire licking at the walls, consuming everything in its path. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself forward. They were almost there. The man stirred slightly, his head rolling against Kai's shoulder. Then, in a barely audible whisper, he spoke. "I shouldn't be here." His voice was weak, barely more than a breath, but the weight of those words sent a chill down Kai's spine. There was no time to ask what he meant. Another explosion rocked the yacht, tilting it dangerously. With no other choice, Kai reached the railing and threw his weight over the edge, dragging the man with him as they plummeted into the ocean below. The impact hit like a concrete wall, knocking the air from Kai's lungs. Salt water rushed up his nose, burning his throat as he fought to resurface. The man, still barely conscious, was sinking fast. Kai's arms moved on instinct, kicking hard as he grabbed onto the man's collar, hauling him upward. The weight pulled him down, but he refused to let go. He had come this far. He wasn't going to let the guy die now. His body screamed from exhaustion, but he forced himself to swim. When they finally broke the surface, Kai sucked in a desperate breath, his chest burning. The yacht loomed behind them, flames consuming what was left of it. The heat was unbearable even from a distance. using what strength he had. Left, Kai kicked toward the fishing boat, his arms shaking as he dragged the man with him. He reached out, gripping the wooden side of the vessel, using every ounce of effort to pull them both up. The man collapsed onto the deck, unmoving, his breathing ragged but steady. Kai barely had a second to catch his breath before a deafening explosion ripped through the air. The yacht erupted in a massive fireball, sending a shockwave across the water. Fiery debris rained down around them, splashes of burning wreckage hitting the ocean's surface with violent force. Kai shielded his face. The blast, pushing the boat backward. His ears rang, his vision blurred for a moment before the burning remains of the yacht settled into the waves. He sat there, gasping for air, his body shaking from exertion. His eyes flickered to the unconscious man lying beside him. This wasn't just some rich guy caught in the wrong place. This was something bigger, something dangerous, and now, whether he wanted to be or not, he was in the middle of it. The man stirred slightly, his breathing still uneven, his body shivering despite the humid air. Kai sat across from him in the small fishing boat, arms crossed, watching as the stranger coughed and slowly blinked himself into awareness. His face was streaked with soot, his expensive suit ruined beyond repair, the once pristine white shirt underneath now stained with seawater and ash. Kai had seen plenty of rich people before, mostly at a distance, walking past the docks in their tailored suits, stepping onto yachts that cost more than he would make in a lifetime. But none of them had ever been dragged half dead from a burning wreck. The man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening with sudden alertness. His breathing quickened as he scanned his surroundings, his body tensing as if expecting another explosion. Where am I?" he murmured, his voice hoarse and strained. His gaze locked onto Kai, searching for answers. Kai tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "Alive," he said flatly, "but just barely." His arms remained crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't one for pleasantries, especially when he had just risked his life for someone he didn't. "No." The man exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as he tried to sit up. A grimace flashed across his face, his muscles stiff with exhaustion. He coughed again, spitting out a mouthful of seawater. His hands trembled as he wiped them over his face, smearing soot across his skin. For a moment he didn't say anything, just stared past Kai, as if processing the fact that he was still breathing. Then, slowly, his expression changed. His brows furrowed slightly, recognition flickering behind his grey eyes. He swallowed hard and ran a hand through his damp, disheveled hair. "The yacht," he muttered under his breath. "The fire. It wasn't an accident." His voice was quieter now, more controlled, but there was a tightness in it, as if he were testing each word carefully before letting it slip. Kai leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "Yeah, no kidding," he said, watching the man closely. "That thing went up like it was built out of gasoline. Someone wanted it gone, and you with it." The man didn't react right away, but Kai saw the flicker of something in his expression, a flash of realization, or maybe confirmation of something he already knew. It wasn't fear. It was anger, cold and calculating, buried beneath the exhaustion. Kai studied him for a few more seconds before sighing. He wasn't the kind of guy who kept up with business tycoons or read newspapers, but something about this man was familiar. The sharp angles of his face, the way he carried himself even in his current state, it all felt like a half-remembered image from somewhere. Then it clicked. Kai narrowed his eyes slightly. "I've seen your face before," he said, more to himself than to the man. "You're someone important." He searched his memory, piecing it together. It didn't take long. "You're that real estate guy," he said finally, his tone shifting with certainty. "Elias Moreau." Elias's jaw tightened slightly at the name, but he didn't confirm or deny it. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply, then exhaled through his nose. "So, you do read the news," he muttered, almost amused despite everything. Kai shrugged. "Not really, but your face is all over the city, pretty hard to miss." He watched as Elias rubbed his temples, still visibly drained from whatever had happened before the explosion. "Guessing someone wasn't happy with you," Kai added, "and decided to solve their problem with a bomb." Elias let out a quiet laugh, though there was nothing humorous about it. He looked at Kai again, this time more intently, as if sizing him up. "You're not with them," he said finally. It wasn't a question, but an observation. "You wouldn't have pulled me out if you were." Kai raised an eyebrow. "Them," he repeated. "I don't even know who they are. I just saw you about to be barbecued and figured you'd rather not be." He gestured vaguely toward the open ocean, where the last remnants of the burning yacht had long since vanished beneath the waves. "You want to tell me who exactly wanted you dead, or am I just supposed to guess?" Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back against the side of the boat, closing his eyes for a brief second before murmuring, "It's a long list." There was weight in those words, a certainty that told. Kai, this wasn't just a simple case of a rich guy making the wrong enemies. Someone had gone to extreme lengths to make sure Elias Moreau never left that yacht alive. And yet, against all odds, he had. Kai sighed and ran a hand through his own damp hair, shaking his head. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. Whoever wanted Elias dead wasn't going to stop just because he survived. If anything, they'd come back even harder. And now, by sheer dumb luck, Kai was stuck right in the middle of it. Kai pulled the boat up to the edge of the dock, securing it with quick, precise knots before turning to Elias, who was still visibly weak but alert. His expensive suit was ruined, still damp from the sea, and streaked with soot. He moved stiffly, his muscles likely aching from whatever had happened. Before the explosion, Kai climbed onto the dock first, scanning the empty stretch of concrete and wooden planks ahead of them. It was late, and the port should have been mostly deserted, but something felt off. His instincts, sharpened from years of surviving in places where danger lurked in the shadows, screamed at him to be cautious. Then he saw it, a black SUV parked near the far end of the pier, its headlights off, but the faint hum of the engine still present. He tensed immediately, his eyes narrowing. A car like that didn't belong here. It was too polished, too deliberate, the kind of vehicle that meant business. It wasn't just some random person waiting around. It was a presence. Kai glanced back at Elias, who had just stepped onto the dock, his movements careful but steady. "You recognize that car?" Kai asked, keeping his voice low, his posture casual but ready. Elias's entire body went rigid, his expression darkened, his jaw clenching as his eyes locked onto the silhouette of a man stepping out of the SUV. The way Elias stiffened told Kai everything he needed to know. This wasn't just paranoia. Whoever that was, they weren't here by coincidence. Elias exhaled sharply, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to leave. Now." There was no hesitation, no questioning. He already knew they were being hunted. Kai didn't argue. He had learned long ago that when someone rich and powerful sounded that certain, it usually meant they had good reason. He kept his steps measured as they moved away from the dock, resisting the urge to break into a sprint. Nothing made a person more of a target than running. The moment they reached the narrow street leading away from the waterfront, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. The man in the suit was no longer alone. A second, figure had stepped out of the SUV, speaking into what looked like a small radio before turning in their direction. They weren't here for a casual conversation. Kai grabbed Elias by the sleeve and pulled him sharply toward a side alley between two rusted storage containers. They ducked into the narrow space just as one of the men started moving toward the dock. "You want to tell me who the hell these guys are?" Kai whispered, keeping his voice low as they pressed against the metal wall, hidden in the shadows. Elias exhaled slowly, his hands balling into fists. "I have a lot of enemies," he admitted, his tone clipped. "But if they're already here, it means they're not just trying to kill me. They're trying to make sure I don't talk." That didn't sound good. Whoever these people were, they weren't just tying up loose ends. They were eliminating them entirely. Kai risked a glance back. toward the dock. One of the men had started walking toward the edge, peering down at the boat. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before someone realized the engine was still warm, that 2 people had just arrived by sea, and that those 2 people were no longer in sight. "We can't stay here," Kai murmured. "If they've got more backup, we'll be boxed in." Elias didn't argue. Instead, he straightened his posture and took a breath, his mind already working through a plan. "We need to get to the city," he said, his voice firmer now. "I know someone who can help us disappear for now." Kai exhaled, sharply, but nodded. He wasn't sure why he was still in this mess, but at this point, backing out wasn't an option. Whoever wanted Elias dead wasn't going to stop. And now, by saving him, Kai had painted a target on his own back. Elias pressed his back against the cold metal wall of a rusted storage container, his breath still unsteady from their escape through the maze of alleys behind the port warehouses. Kai crouched beside him, his eyes sharp, scanning the narrow pathway ahead. They had been moving non-stop since slipping, away from the men in the SUV, weaving through shadows, avoiding open streets. The dock workers had long since gone home, leaving the place eerily deserted. It was a good place to disappear, for now. Elias's fingers twitched as he reached into his pocket, instinctively checking for anything useful. He expected nothing, maybe a ruined wallet or a few crumpled bills. But when his fingertips brushed against the rough edges of a small, burnt piece of paper, he frowned. He pulled it out, holding it up against the faint light from a distant street lamp. The paper was scorched at the edges, as if it had been through the same hell as him, and scribbled across it, barely legible through the soot, were a set of numbers. "I don't remember writing this," he muttered, more to himself than to Kai. His brow furrowed as he turned it over, searching for any other clues. The ink had smudged slightly, but the numbers were still clear. It looked like a set of coordinates. His mind raced, trying to piece together when this could have ended up in his pocket. Had someone given it to him before the explosion? Had he found it and forgotten? His memory of the past few hours was still fragmented, blurred by adrenaline and exhaustion. Kai reached out, taking the paper from Elias's hands, his eyes narrowing as he examined the numbers. He didn't need long to recognize what they meant. "These are coordinates," he said, his voice low. "And this location, it's out in the ocean, pretty damn close to where your yacht went up in flames." He looked up at Elias, his expression serious. "If someone went through the trouble of making sure you had this, it means something." Elias exhaled sharply, his fingers running through his damp, disheveled hair. "Or it's a trap," he muttered, his mind already running through the possibilities. If these coordinates pointed to something valuable, then someone had either wanted him to find it or wanted him dead before he could. Either way, there was only one way to know for sure. Before they could speak another word, a sharp crack split through the air. The sound of a bullet ricocheting off metal sent both of them ducking instinctively. Another shot followed, hitting the container just inches from Elias's head, sending a shower of sparks and debris down around them. "Shit!" Kai hissed, gripping Elias's arm and yanking him into motion. "They found us!" Elias didn't need to be told twice. He pushed off the container, running behind Kai as another round of gunfire tore through the alley. The echoes bounced off the walls, making it impossible to tell how many shooters there were or where exactly they were positioned. Elias didn't have a weapon. Hell, he barely had the strength to keep up, but survival instincts kicked in fast. They weaved through the narrow paths between shipping crates, their footsteps pounding against the concrete. Kai grabbed Elias's arm again, pulling him sharply to the right, dodging into an even tighter alleyway that barely had enough space for them to move side by side. More bullets slammed into the walls behind them, chipping away at the rusted metal. They weren't just being shot at, they were being hunted. Elias gritted his teeth, forcing himself to push forward despite the burning in his lungs. If they stopped now, They wouldn't get another chance. Kai spotted an opening ahead, a stack of crates leading up to the roof of one of the smaller warehouses. Without hesitation, he grabbed the edge and hauled himself up, his movements quick and fluid. He turned, reaching down for Elias. "Come on, old man, move!" Elias barely had time to glare before another bullet struck the ground near his foot. With a burst of adrenaline, he jumped, gripping Kai's wrist as he was pulled up onto the crate. They scrambled over the edge of the warehouse roof, rolling onto the flat surface just as another spray of gunfire hit the wall below them. Panting, Elias turned his head toward Kai, who was already looking back at the alley they had just escaped from. The shooters weren't following, yet, but that wouldn't last long. He still had the coordinates clenched in his hand, damp with sweat. Whatever this paper led to, it was important enough for someone to kill over, and that meant they had no choice but to find out why. Kai followed Elias through the narrow streets, his breathing controlled, despite the aching protest of his muscles. They had been running, climbing, and cutting through alleys for what felt like hours, always a step ahead of whoever was after them. Elias moved with determination, but Kai could see the strain on his face. The older man wasn't built for this kind of escape, but desperation had a way of pushing limits. When Elias finally slowed down and gestured toward a tall building ahead, Kai barely spared it a glance before nodding. He was no stranger to high-rises, but this one was in a different league. Sleek glass panels reflected the dim city lights, its structure towering over everything else in the district. This wasn't just some apartment. This was a fortress in the sky. They reached a side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where security might ask too many questions. Elias punched a code into a small keypad near the service elevator, his fingers moving with the muscle memory of someone who had done it 1,000 times. The doors slid open, and they stepped inside. The ride up was silent, save for Elias's heavy breathing as he leaned against the wall. "This place should be secure," he muttered, more to himself than to Kai. "No one gets in without clearance." Kai didn't answer. He had been around long enough to know that the more someone believed they were safe, the bigger the risk. When the elevator doors opened, Kai's instincts flared immediately. Something was off. The hallway leading to the penthouse was dimly lit, the usual soft glow of luxury now replaced with flickering emergency lights. The subtle hum of security systems, motion sensors, cameras was gone. He didn't need to be an expert to know what that meant. Someone had cut the power, or at least everything that mattered. He glanced at Elias, whose expression had darkened. "They knew I'd come," Elias whispered, his voice tense. Kai moved first, stepping out cautiously. The penthouse door was closed but not locked. That alone was a problem. Elias reached for the handle, hesitating for the briefest second before pushing it open. The inside was exactly what Kai expected from a man like Elias. Expensive furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a bar stocked with bottles that probably cost more than Kai had made in his entire life. But none of that mattered now. The place felt wrong. A glass of wine, half empty, sat on the counter, fresh enough that condensation still clung to it. A chair was slightly pulled back from the dining table, as if someone had just stood up. Elias saw it too. "Someone's been here," he murmured. Kai didn't wait for more signs. He stepped further inside, scanning corners, checking blind spots. His instincts screamed at him. They were walking into something, and it was too late to turn back. He turned his head slightly to warn Elias, just as the window shattered. A single, precise shot tore through the air, exploding through the glass and embedding itself into the far wall. Kai reacted instantly, grabbing Elias by the collar and pulling him down behind the marble kitchen island. Another shot followed, cracking through the glass panel behind them, sending shards cascading onto the sleek wooden floor. Elias pressed a hand against his chest, breathing heavily. "Sniper!" he said between gritted teeth. Kai was already moving, eyes darting toward the open space of the living room. "No shit," he muttered. His mind worked fast. They were on the top floors. Whoever was shooting had a clear line of sight from one of the buildings across the street. That meant they weren't just being watched, they were being hunted. The next shot hit even closer, barely missing the counter where Kai had been crouching a second earlier. He didn't need to tell Elias to move. The older man was already scrambling to his feet, following Kai toward the back of the apartment where there were fewer windows. They had seconds before whoever was out there adjusted their angle. "We can't go back the way we came," Elias said sharply. "Stairs?" Kai asked. Elias shook his head. "They'll be watching. The service exit leads to a maintenance shaft." Kai didn't ask how Elias knew that. He just nodded and ran. Elias followed, his steps heavier, slower, but fueled by sheer adrenaline. They reached the back hallway just as another shot shattered the last of the main windows, glass raining down like deadly confetti. Whoever was out there wasn't just trying to scare them. They were taking their time, making every bullet count. Kai threw open the door Elias pointed to, revealing a narrow metal staircase leading downward. "Move!" Kai said, shoving Elias forward. Another gunshot rang out behind them, this one smacking against the door frame as Kai pulled it shut behind him. He didn't need any more confirmation. Whoever these people were, they weren't planning on letting Elias walk away alive. And by staying at his side, Kai had just made himself a target too. Kai's breathing was steady, despite the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He and Elias had barely escaped the sniper's line of fire, slipping through a maintenance access point that led them into the building's service corridors. The walls here were narrow, the air thick with the scent of stale concrete and dust. It wasn't exactly the kind of place a billionaire like Elias Moreau was used to, but right now, luxury didn't matter. Survival did. Kai moved first, keeping his steps light, scanning every corner as they advanced. The tension in the air was thick. He could feel Elias processing everything that had just happened, putting together the pieces of a puzzle that up until now had been fragmented and unclear. Elias exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Only a few people knew I would be on that yacht," he muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "And now my own security team is trying to kill me." His jaw clenched, his mind working at full speed. "That means—" Kai didn't hesitate. "The problem comes from inside," he finished for him. His voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. He wasn't new to betrayal. He had seen what money and power did to people. No one went through the effort of sinking a yacht and sending a sniper unless they were eliminating something or someone dangerous. And Elias, whether he wanted to admit it or not, was that person. Elias came to a stop, his hands balling into fists at his sides. His grey eyes darkened, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. "The board," he said, almost to himself. His company's executive council, men in tailored suits who smiled at him in meetings, who had built fortunes under his leadership. "They want me gone." There was no hesitation in his words. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was fact. Kai studied him carefully, arms crossed. "Makes sense," he said, voice even. "You're the last obstacle standing in their way, right? Some billion-dollar land deal?" He had overheard enough conversations in back alleys and shipping yards to know how these things worked. Big business didn't just run on contracts and handshakes, it ran on power plays, and when someone stood in the way of a deal that could make men even richer, they didn't file lawsuits. They hired people to make sure the problem disappeared permanently. Elias let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Henry Calloway," he muttered. "That bastard. His second in command, his most trusted partner, the man who had sat beside him in boardrooms for years, pretending to be a friend." Elias should have seen it. The signs had been there. Small hesitations in meetings, certain decisions being made behind his back, whispers that never reached his ears. He had been so focused on the business itself that he hadn't realized he was the one being outmaneuvered. Kai raised an eyebrow. "So Calloway set you up?" he asked. "Or did he just give the order?" It made a difference. Some people liked to get their hands dirty. Others preferred to sit back and let hired professionals do the work. Elias exhaled through his nose, his gaze hard. "Both," he said. "He's the one who made sure I was on that yacht, and he's the one who gave the council the push they needed to agree." His voice tightened. "They want me dead, Kai. Not just out of the company. They need me gone." Kai didn't blink. He had seen greed before, but this was something else. "And if they went this far, they won't stop," he said. "They'll keep sending people after you until they're sure you're a corpse." It wasn't a warning. It was a simple fact. Elias nodded, his face unreadable, but there was something in his posture now, something Kai hadn't seen before. Resolve. He had spent years at the top, surrounded by power, controlling every move in his world. He wasn't going to let himself be erased. He looked at Kai, his expression sharp. "Then we don't let them." Kai smirked slightly, rolling his shoulders. "Finally," he said, "something I can work with." Elias stepped into the dimly lit warehouse, his eyes sweeping the space with controlled precision. The meeting location was carefully chosen, far from prying eyes, no security cameras, no uninvited guests. Just old crates, the scent of oil lingering in the air, and the faint flicker of a dying. Overhead, light casting long shadows. He moved with confidence, but Kai, watching from the darkness of a nearby corner, knew better. Elias wasn't calm. He was holding himself together, every step calculated, every breath measured. He was walking into the lion's den, and he knew it. Vincent DeLuca was already waiting. The man stood near an abandoned workbench, arms crossed over his broad chest, his sharp features barely illuminated by the weak glow of a hanging light. He was built like a man who had spent his life breaking others apart, tall, muscular, his knuckles scarred from past encounters. His suit, though expensive, was worn in a way that suggested function over style. He wasn't here to impress. He was here to deliver a message. His dark eyes tracked Elias's every move, like a predator watching prey that had wandered too close. Elias stopped a few feet away, keeping his posture straight, his expression unreadable. "You know why I'm here," he said, his voice steady. "I need a name." DeLuca exhaled slowly, as if amused. He tilted his head slightly, considering Elias for a moment before smirking. "A name?" he echoed, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that only men, like him, could manage. "You think you're still in control here, Moreau?" He took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Elias. "You think you walk in here, ask your little questions, and I just hand over what you want?" Kai shifted slightly in the shadows, tensing. He knew the type. DeLuca wasn't just another hired gun. He was the kind of man who enjoyed what he did, who didn't just kill for money, he killed for sport. And right now, he was playing with Elias, waiting to see how much pressure he could apply before something snapped. Elias didn't flinch. "I know you pulled the trigger," he said. "I know you were the one sent to finish the job on that yacht. But you don't make the decisions, DeLuca. You don't sign the checks. Someone gave you the order." "I want to know who." DeLuca chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "You really don't see it, do you?" He took another step forward, standing just close enough that Elias could see the amusement flickering behind his cold gaze. "You always thought you were untouchable. The great Elias Moreau built an empire, played king at the top of the food chain. But the thing about kings," his smirk widened, "eventually someone decides. They're better off without them." Elias's jaw tightened, but his voice didn't waver. "Give me a name." DeLuca sighed dramatically, as if humoring him. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, but not enough to hide the satisfaction in it. "You already know," he murmured. "Your own right hand. The board wanted you gone, but Calloway," he grinned, "he signed the damn contract." Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. For a moment, everything else faded. The warehouse, the danger, even DeLuca's smug expression. Henry Calloway, his business partner, his friend, the man he had trusted. Above all others, it should have made sense. The signs had been there, the way Calloway had started keeping things from him, the sudden shifts in decision-making. But Elias had ignored them, too caught up in his own world to see what was happening right under his nose. DeLuca studied him, clearly. enjoying the realization sinking in. "Bet that stings, huh?" he said, his tone mockingly sympathetic. "All those years, all that loyalty. And in the end, he put a price tag on your head and signed the dotted line." Elias clenched his fists, but he didn't lash out. That wasn't his style. Rage was useful, but only when controlled, and right now he needed control more than anything. "If you think this is over," he said slowly, each word carrying a promise, "you don't know me as well as you think." DeLuca smirked. "No," he admitted, "but Calloway does, and that's why you're a dead man." Walking, Kai had heard enough. His fingers tightened around the grip of the knife he had been palming, ready to intervene if necessary. But Elias didn't need saving. Not yet. The man was coiled, his fury a quiet, simmering thing, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Kai had a feeling that, when he did, it wouldn't be DeLuca who walked away from this unscathed. Elias sat at the edge of a worn wooden table, his fingers drumming against its surface as he stared down at the stack of documents in front of him. The dim light of the safe house barely illuminated the words, but he didn't need to read them again. He had already memorized every detail. These papers, these files, they were more than just evidence. They were weapons. Henry Calloway and the council had orchestrated his downfall, signed his death warrant, and moved forward as if he had already been buried. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated just how far Elias Moreau was. Willing to go, to take back what was his. Kai leaned against the wall nearby, arms crossed, watching Elias with mild amusement. He had seen men burn with revenge before, but Elias wasn't just angry. He was methodical, cold. He wasn't looking for a way to get even. He was looking for a way to end this, permanently. "So what's the play?" Kai asked, tilting his head slightly. "We could leak these to the media, let the public eat them alive, or do you have something bigger in mind?" Elias finally looked up, his expression sharp, unreadable. "Leaking it isn't enough," he said simply. "This isn't just about exposing them. If we do that, they'll spin the story, bury it under legalities, find a way to weasel out like they always do." He exhaled sharply, pushing the papers toward Kai. This is leverage. The only thing men like them fear more than prison is losing everything they built. We don't just make them look bad, we make them collapse." Kai smirked, picking up one of the documents and flipping through it. Bank statements, offshore accounts, secret backdoor deals, things that, if exposed properly, wouldn't just ruin reputations, they would destroy lives. "All right," he said, nodding approvingly. "Now we're talking." He tossed the paper back onto the table. "So how do we make sure this doesn't just disappear into some backroom settlement?" Elias stood, walking over to a small laptop on the counter. "We hit them where they can't control the damage," he said, opening the screen. "Live press conference, federal agencies, investors, the works." He glanced at Kai. "But first, we bait them." Kai arched an eyebrow. "Bait them how?" Elias's lips curled into a slow, calculated smile. "Calloway and the others think I'm still on the run, desperate, with no resources. They believe they've won. But if they get a whiff that I have something big, they'll come running to shut it down." He tapped the laptop. "We set a trap, a fake leak. Let them scramble, thinking they can control it. And when they do," he gestured toward the documents, "we make sure the world is watching." Kai let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered. "You really want to see these guys burn, don't you?" Elias's expression darkened, but there was no hesitation. "They tried to kill me," he said. "They tried to erase me, and they almost did. But they forgot one thing." He met Kai's gaze, his voice cold, razor-sharp. "I built this empire, and now I'm going to watch it fall on my terms." Kai grinned, pushing off the wall. "Now that," he said, "is my kind of plan." The conference room on the top floor of Moreau Industries was filled with the kind of men who had never known what it felt like to lose. They sat around the long, polished table, dressed in custom-tailored suits, sipping from glasses filled with aged whiskey, their conversations low but confident. Henry Calloway sat at the head of the table, posture relaxed but commanding a picture of control. This was supposed to be his victory, the final step in erasing Elias Moreau's name from the company he had built. The official paperwork for Elias's removal was stacked neatly in front of him, waiting for signatures. He glanced at the other board members, his mouth twitching into a smug smile. But then the doors burst open. The first to enter were federal agents, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable as they moved in, their badges flashing under the artificial light. The board members stiffened immediately, their gazes snapping toward Calloway. Before anyone could process what was happening, the journalists followed, cameras rolling, microphones raised, flashes flickering as they flooded the space. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs of control and power, was now a storm of shouted questions, accusations, and chaos. Calloway shot to his feet, his chair scraping back against the floor. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice sharp. But beneath the anger was something else, panic. Screens flickered to life around the room. One by one, files and documents were displayed. Offshore accounts, falsified contracts, illegal transactions. The kind of evidence that no amount of lawyers or PR teams could spin away. It was all there, for the entire world to see. Then came the worst part. A video feed, crystal clear, played on every screen. Vincent DeLuca's face filled the displays, his voice crisp as he detailed every dirty order he had received. The hit on Elias, the board's approval, and finally, the signature of Henry Calloway sealing the deal. Calloway's face drained of color. He spun around, searching for a way out, for a defense, for anything. This is doctored lies. His voice cracked as he slammed a fist against the table. "This is an attack against me. I will sue every single—" A slow clap cut through the noise. The room turned toward the doorway, and there he was, Elias Moreau. He stood there, pristine despite everything they had done to erase him. His suit, pressed and fitted, was a stark contrast to the man they had left for dead. His expression was unreadable, but his grey eyes were sharp, calculating, drinking in the sight of the empire that had betrayed him falling apart. He stepped forward, calm, controlled, letting the weight of his presence settle over the room like a final verdict. Calloway's lips parted, his shock shifting into rage. "You," he hissed. "This is your doing." Elias tilted his head slightly, a small smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. "You sound surprised," he said, his voice even. "Did you really think I would just disappear?" He took another step forward, the cameras catching every moment. "You tried to kill me. You failed. You tried to take everything I built. And now, Henry, I'm here to watch you lose." Calloway clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, Moreau." Elias exhaled softly, his smirk vanishing, his expression turning to ice. "No, Henry," he said, his voice lowering just enough to send a chill through the room. "You have no idea who I am." Federal agents closed in, hands gripping Calloway's arms as he resisted, shouting curses and threats. The board members remained frozen, their entire world unraveling in real time. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted, and the weight of decades of corruption collapsed in a single moment. In the back of the room, leaning casually against the wall, Kai watched the scene unfold with an amused half-smile. He had seen power shifts before, seen men fall from their thrones. But this was something else. He glanced at Elias, who was watching Calloway get dragged out of the room with the kind of calm that came from knowing you had already won. Kai chuckled softly. "Gotta say," he muttered, just loud enough for Elias to hear, "I do love a happy ending." But Elias didn't answer. He just stood there, watching the wreckage of the empire he had built crumble around him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, something dark, something unfinished, because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. That was an intense ride. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to Golden Stories, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Who was your favorite character? What twist surprised you the most? And if you know someone who would love this thriller, share it with them. More gripping stories are coming soon. Stay tuned.